Throughout our world and throughout history, one of the greatest causes of death, alongside war, starvation, and violent nature, that fells even the strongest of us, is disease. No matter who you may be, a rich aristocrat or an impoverished laborer, you can be humbled and stricken down with illness. A certain disease that's been devastating to humanity since the start, responsible for billions of deaths, is TB, or tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is an infectious disease caused by a bacteria, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which mainly affects the lungs, although it can affect other organs too, like the kidneys, brain, spine, and skin. When the disease manifests in the spine, Pott's disease is developed. A malformation of the spine leaves a hunchback posture that can cause bone destruction and paraplegia, paralysis of the lower body. When the disease manifests in the skin, painful lesions can develop, known as lupus vulgaris, or tuberculosis luposa, which occurs most commonly on the face, giving a signature look to those who have the illness. The disease is spread by coughing, sneezing, spitting, or talking, which sends droplets in the air which contain the tuberculosis bacteria. This makes a disease most easily spread in dense groups of people and in indoor areas where the droplets circulate in the air for longer. All it takes is a few germs of the disease to get infected. However, it's important to differentiate tuberculosis infection with tuberculosis disease. Tuberculosis infection means that bacteria entered the body and started propagating, although in most cases people with healthy immune systems can contain the infection or even eliminate the infection. These people have no symptoms and cannot spread the disease. Tuberculosis infection is quite common. About 1/3 of the people in the world likely have tuberculosis infection, and only about 10% of people will actually go on to develop the deadly tuberculosis disease. This usually happens due to a weak immune system, which may be caused by something like malnutrition, which allows the tuberculosis infection to overcome the immune system and become tuberculosis disease. Now, tuberculosis disease is deadly. Symptoms of tuberculosis disease include prolonged cough, sometimes with blood, chest pain, weakness and fatigue, weight loss, fever and chills, lack of appetite, and night sweats. Untreated, about 50% of cases of tuberculosis disease are fatal. Tuberculosis has existed since Antiquity, with the oldest known strain being found in bison remains in Wyoming, dated to be 17,000 years ago. It is unknown, however, if tuberculosis originated in bovine creatures, such as bison, buffalo, cows, etc., and spread to humans, or if a disease spread to humans and bovines from a common ancestor. Analysis of skeletal remains of prehistoric humans have shown signs of tuberculosis, and signs of tuberculosis have also been found in Egyptian mummies from as early as 3000 BC. In the ancient world, the Greek physician and philosopher Hippocrates wrote about a disease of weakness of the lung with fever and cough, and was known as a commonest disease of the period. He called it phthisis, which would serve as an academic name for a disease until the 19th century. In Rome, tuberculosis surged with the massive growth of the empire. Galen, the personal physician of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, listed a disease with similar symptoms, such as a bloody cough, and recommended fresh air, milk, and sea voyages as successful treatments for the disease. In the 18th century, tuberculosis was known as the White Death due to the pale skin tone seen in patients. Tuberculosis had become epidemic in Western Europe, and showed a seasonal pattern, with a majority of cases occurring during a spring and summer season. It had a mortality rate of 900 deaths per 100,000 population per year. For instance, heart disease, the #1 killer in the US, causes over 700,000 deaths per year, and has a mortality of 210 per 100,000 population. So if we were to place the tuberculosis mortality rate over the US population, we would get just about 3 million deaths per year in the United States. This mortality rate was elevated in the younger population, which led to tuberculosis also being known as the robber of youth. In the 19th century, tuberculosis had reached its peak in Europe, causing nearly 25% of all deaths, which then it was commonly referred to as consumption. This was even after its modern name was already coined by Johann Lucas Schönlein with his piece General and Special Pathology and Therapy in 1832. On an interesting side note, folklore surrounding tuberculosis gave rise to a concept of vampires, as when one family member died from a disease, the others would lose their health slowly, which was thought to be caused by the original tuberculosis victim draining the life from the other family members. And this is what likely inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. Because often an entire family was affected by the disease, tuberculosis was thought to be a hereditary disease rather than an infectious one. Rising to the challenge came an opportunistic doctor by the name of John Cron, who owned the Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. He sent a group of tuberculosis patients into the cave in 1839, hoping that the constant temperature and pure air of the cave would cure the disease. They all died within a year. In 1859, the first sanatorium for tuberculosis was built in Silesia, which is now modern-day Poland. Here, patients were exposed to plentiful amounts of high-altitude, fresh air, and good nutrition, in hopes of giving the immune system the best chance to fight off a disease. Coinciding with the identification of the tuberculosis bacteria in 1882, tuberculosis had become a notifiable disease in Britain, meaning any cases of it had to be reported to the government. Campaigns had sprung up encouraging people to stop spitting in public spaces, and encouraged the infected poor to enter sanatoria that resembled prisons. In comparison, sanatoria for middle and upper classes offered excellent care and constant medical attention. However, even within best conditions in a sanatoria, 50% of those who entered died within 5 years. By 1918, tuberculosis still caused 1 in 6 deaths in France, and within World War I and II, tuberculosis was the leading cause of discharge in the US Army. However, over time, annual tuberculosis cases would decrease in developed nations due to better education and health practices, more abundant sources of food, and drugs to combat the disease. The discovery of penicillin and sulfonamide were not the magic bullet to fight the disease. Although these drugs were effective against syphilis, strep throat, meningitis, and others, Mycobacterium tuberculosis was not one of them. But in the midst of a race to discover new antibiotics came Streptomycin, a drug isolated from a bacteria commonly found in soil, Streptomyces griseus. This was the magic bullet that could kill tuberculosis. Thanks to the drug and the others that followed, tuberculosis cases plummeted in developed societies. In the United States, tuberculosis went from being the 7th leading cause of death in 1940 to the 16th leading cause of death in 1960 to leaving the list entirely in 1967. As well, life expectancy increased from 62 in 1940 to 70 in 1970, perhaps reflecting the medical innovations in that time. In the modern era, tuberculosis is still a prevalent disease, remaining one of the leading infectious killers alongside HIV and AIDS and malaria. Every year, 10 million people contract the disease, and despite being preventable and curable, 1.5 million people die every year, which is about the equivalent of the population of Hawaii dying every year. These deaths occur more in poorer and lesser developed areas. More than 2/3 of the global total of tuberculosis cases occur in Bangladesh, China, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Pakistan, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Thankfully, however, we have treatment and prevention options. There is a vaccine for tuberculosis, with more currently being developed, and we have various treatments, chiefly being antibiotics, to combat disease. Unthankfully, however, due to improper use of antibiotics, many strains of tuberculosis have developed that are resistant to antibiotics. People who contract these particular strains have to explore other treatment options. The World Health Organization, currently under the End TB strategy, aims for a 90% reduction in tuberculosis mortality and an 80% reduction in tuberculosis incidence worldwide by 2030.